Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University, Belfast. This is LawPod.
So welcome everyone. This is part 2 of a 2-podcast series that began on Monday. It marks an event that we're holding at Queen's, an international multidisciplinary symposium on the question of origin deprivation, genetic identity losses. I'm joined by John McLeod from University of Leeds, Frances Latchford from York University in Toronto, and Boon Young Han from the National University of Seoul. And I will go around the table and let everyone introduce themselves to say what their disciplines, their research background is, and then we'll reflect back on some of the highlights of the last 4 days, which have been hectic. We're tired, but I think happy. I think we're happy but content. We'll start with John.
So I'm John McLeod. I'm Professor of Postcolonial and Diaspora Literatures at the University of Leeds in the UK. I'm a literature person. I work in the School of English. I'm the author of a book called Lifelines, Writing Transcultural Adoption, which was published in 2015. And I'm also an executive board member of ASAC, the Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Culture. And I'm delighted to be here, Queen's University, and it's been a fantastic event. Really looking forward to reflecting upon it.
And I'm Frances Latchford. I'm an associate professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. And my areas of interest are critical adoption studies and sexuality studies, and sometimes those two things intersect in my work. And I am thrilled to be here and have had a wonderful week as well. I've learned a lot and met some wonderful people. And I've just been thrilled to be here.
My name is Boon Young Han. I'm at Seoul National University in Seoul, Korea. I come from social work. I'm a PhD student trying to write about the South Korean adoption special law from 2012 and the policy process that has been praised for including the participation of stakeholders such as adult adoptees. But we also see that obviously other stakeholders greatly benefited from that. I'm part of the network that's called KAARN, Korean Adoptee Adoption Research Network, and a more newly founded group, a DKRG, Danish Korean Rights Group. That has been an absolutely pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I should have mentioned at the start, the Korean Adoptee Adoption Research Network is, of course, the partner organization that has made the symposium possible this week. Okay, so I thought we could reflect back on some of the highlights this week. We had 2 judges, 2 members of the judiciary called in and spoke to us and with us. I thought that was pretty good. They would both have an interest in human rights or in adoption, family law. We had a speaker from kinship care, at which point, well, some of us, got a bit emotional. I think she left us a little bit devastated is maybe a bit strong, but that was quite an emotive, impactful talk that she gave. But I'll hand over to you guys I hope I haven't stolen your highlight moment, but just you guys, any sort of thoughts or things that you thought maybe emerged from the week, sort of some unexpected, I thought rehoming of children was an unexpected theme.
I don't know that I had a favorite bit. I did find everything that I witnessed informative and engaging. And I was, edified by all the different perspectives that were presented and all the dialogue between people who had different perspectives. It was a real pleasure to be at an event where people are listening and thinking together, even if they don't think the same way. So it was a very engaging symposium in that respect. It was interesting, the overlap in papers. So not overlap in topics so much, but maybe in some of the ideas in terms of approaches. So there were a number of philosophers at the conference. We had some people who were doing more things along the line of social science, and then people also doing some work around, literature. Your work also in terms of literature and law was fascinating, Alice. So there were a number of things that I found very enjoyable.
Thank you. I was glad to see some social workers joining in the conversation. I guess to represent, differing viewpoints. I have a tendency to have the tunnel vision of, give me contact with birth family, give me, birth certificate, and I can tend to go down a rabbit hole or find a hill to die on. A lot of mixed metaphors. So it was good to have other voices that were saying genetic identity isn't everything. And don't forget child protection. And what do you even mean by origin? What do you mean by genetic identity or identity? So I think there were some very good, fruitful discussions on that. We were joined by some Scottish adoptees who had very good debate with Sir Bernard, Court of Appeal judge, on the rights of adoptees. Why can't we, it's the opposite of relinquish, undo or reject being adopted and reclaim your original identity? So there was that. There was a frank exchange of views, I think, and some good discussions.
Yeah, I think there was a really varied series of agendas that were coming into play and coming into the room. There were those of us who were asking those critical questions about origins and origin deprivation, and maybe the ways in which origin deprivation is something produced by an environment in which knowing your origins is understood to be essential to, or the key to one's identity. And then, of course, that there are others, for whom the quest for those documents of origin is absolutely essential to their sense of being. And I really was struck by the extent to which the different agendas and different ways of engaging with those questions were not incompatible. Yeah. And that one could, support seemingly contrary things at once. And maybe that's one of the things that an event like this does, as we move across a whole range of professionals, is to understand the dimensionality of adoption and adopted life, and how what might seem to be positions that could be contrary or at loggerheads actually aren't. They're part of a wider dimensional conversation that we need to have with ourselves and we need to have with each other if we're going to learn from the various positions in which we find ourselves. So I found the week highly educative, not least because at a couple of occasions, and these for me would be my highlights, I've been challenged, with the ways that some colleagues have talked about even a word like identity, which for me is a very troubling, problematic word, and where for other colleagues it's been a word which has been absolutely concrete and essential. And it's good to have one's intellectual position constantly under review and inflected by and provincialized by the needs and the expertise and the values of others. And I think it's essential for us, if we work in the wider horizon of adoption studies, to have that openness. And sometimes that's not easy. I mean, you mentioned before, Alice, there was maybe a tear or two at one of those kinds of, in those conversations, because it can be for many of us who are inward of the so-called adoption triad. And myself, as an adoptee as well as an adoption studies scholar, I can't help but be inside that. It can be quite emotionally trying as well. And I've come in events over the years to really value that, and I very much valued that this week.
It was a good week in that sense. Well, for many reasons, but yeah, for that, as you say, to be surprised, I think by certain conversations.
I think you've been able to gather really people from a really broad range of disciplines, but also from very different, cultural backgrounds and geographically. But then I think what I take from it is really the similarities that we have and the way that we can build on each other's work, and how inspiring it is, not just to be allowed to talk about what we love to read and write about, but then hear what is going on also in other parts of the world. And you had a colleague that came into the room yesterday and said, "Oh my God, now they start excavating." Yes, excavating. And this is happening here locally, which then resembles so much of what we're seeing in South Korea right now. And I mean, then we have another participant who says, well, that's also happening in Canada.
That's right.
And so when we broaden it out and we just talk about the adoption process, procedure, history, I think that is maybe where we are in the history now, that we start to unfold really what has happened and what happened at that time. So hear these stories and hear that, these seems sadly to be another characteristics of the adoption process, that is very interesting. And I think we also feel a little bit that we need to keep on going with our work. There is more to do, but it's so amazing that you've been able to really gather so many different people from around the world. Yeah.
Thank you. My tentacles are everywhere. I have a tendency to bug people, and I need a wide platform for that. I think that the commonalities, across historical eras, adoption it's sort of always been there, and the issues with it, maybe they change form, but they're maybe not that new. As I know, we talked yesterday about abandonment, exposure of infants, folklore, fairy tales. And then, as you say, it was very, very timely. It closed with a colleague who came in and said what's happening in Ireland at the moment. They've appointed someone to be the commissioner to handle the excavations. Obviously, the Tuam babies, the great scandal of babies in a septic tank, hundreds of them. Do we excavate? Do we memorialize? Some would say, just not let it go, but don't upset people. Just let things settle. As you say, Canada has seen this. Really, many church-led initiatives have
had
resulted
disastrous
in that.
results. Yes, I was also taken with the connections between your work, Alice, and Emily Hipshins-Boweit's around what the adoptee represents, because in your discussion of law and literature, and in particular the Grimm's fairy tales, where child abandonment and or removal in the context of, for instance, those fairy tales is set up as the ultimate threat to any family, the worst thing that could possibly happen to undo a family. And the connection with Emily's idea around what the adoptee can symbolize in terms of the dissolution and incoherence of family as it relates to the Frankenstein monster, for instance, right? The symbolism of the adoptee as a threat or something to be afraid of, and how that plays out in so much of literature, so many stories that focus on orphans or adoptees or even reunion stories, right? But at the beginning of the story, of course, it's seen as that sort of a threat. So the implications of that for contemporary experience as it relates to adoption or adoptive relations is with us, and families and children are being groomed on tales and stories and narratives and fictions around those ideas. So that was very fascinating to me as well, about the connections on that front, but also speaks to issues around, residential schools in Canada or Magdalene homes in Ireland, or also in terms of baby lifts and baby scoops at different times, for instance, in Korea and also in Greece. I was fascinated to hear the history about Greece and the baby lifts, essentially, or what's the word I'm looking for? Moving them to the U.S. and
Trafficking.
Trafficking. That's right. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been reminded at this event of the absolute centrality, not marginality, of adoption to the history of the various nations and cultures that we're engaged with. Here on the island of Ireland, in North America, mainland Europe, Southeast Asia. These are central to the mechanics of power and the state. and this is also a way of responding to what Frances has raised here in relation to Emily's paper, also to your own, Alice, which I enjoyed very much here at the event.
As did I.
It's that sense of, what does the adoptee carry? Yeah. Now, for some of us, we might answer that through a kind of genetic lens. The adoptee might carry links or relations to other people. There's a way of answering that question biogenetically, if you like. But there's also, and here I'm thinking of what Tobias presented us with, also Ryan's wonderful paper I thoroughly enjoyed the other day. That sense of the adoptee carrying histories, being produced by histories that they also kind of subsequently carry. And the cultural freight with which the adoptee or the unfamilied figure is burdened with, which of course is transhistorical and also something which is manifest in different ways across culture, and that's a lot for the adoptee figure or the adopted person to have to deal with. That sense of one is, on the one hand, thinking of Ryan's paper, ghostly and unsubstantial but on the other hand, overburdened or burdened with so much that one is also kind of conscious of. So I've been struck by the ways our conversations have taken us to different ways of answering that question. What does the adoptee figure carry with them?
And what are the fears that people project onto you if you are adopted and or have adoptive ties, in terms of the interrogations you experience throughout a life? If you have adoptive ties or are adopted, where people are constantly questioning the reality of your relationships and or your identity and or, interrogating you around, do you know your origins, and all the pressures that you would experience in a world that is so invested in biological ties that you can't help but be exposed to other people's fears that they then project onto you. And then, whatever age you are in your life, wherever you are in your life, if it's known that you're associated with and or touched by adoption, in quotation marks, scare quotes, people just feel that that's something they can just start asking you about. And there's a real way in which you can be diminished by the ways in which they phrase their questions about the reality of your experience and or relationships. So, that's something that's quite profound to think about too, because I don't think it's something that a lot of people realize when they start to ask what really are and can be intrusive questions for many people at different times and depending on the context.
Yeah. We probably all have been asked interesting questions over the years. If you confide in someone, if you say, well, I'm searching, or I'm in reunion, or if at the start of your search is quite a vulnerable time, because you get a wide range of, some people will say, oh, it's lovely, and they're buying into it will be a fairy tale, there will be the fairy tale ending. And then we have to say, oh, you want to read some fairy tales. The endings are not always, terribly pleasant. I've had, why would you want to search? Well, it gave you away. Why would you want to do that? Or, but you're going to offend, these people have privacy rights. I hope you don't turn up on their doorstep, wielding an axe. So you do get a wide range of questions there. If you say to them, truth recovery, I'm in the business of that, which sounds a little grand, but if you can tie it to that, if you can say, well, look around you, what's happening in Ukraine? There's war crimes, there's atrocities. What happened elsewhere? I'm not saying I was the victim of an atrocity, though I was baby scoop era and obviously have been affected and rendered a bit bonkers by experiences. Did dwell in orphanage for 8 months. It didn't make me a better person, but it gave me an interest. But I think if you tie it possibly to people, they understand truth recovery. They don't necessarily understand why maybe we individually search. But if you give it that political dimension, as you say, baby scoops, baby boxes, they're not a thing of the past. There's always a fresh, yesterday was so timely, on excavations happening. There's always something there.
I think it's interesting, adoptees will know that, how there seems to be no boundaries to the private or personal questions that can be given or be asked to an adoptee. And then if we do search, we run into this issue of privacy. So the boundaries between what is private and public, I think, is something that adoptees have always had to negotiate. And obviously, there are great limitations when we narrow adoption down to a single experience. So if we look at these ongoing investigations now, I think that has created a different type of attention and awareness and interest in adoption. And just following the debate in South Korea, there is actually a good amount of people who come out now and are supportive and say, well, we don't want, human trafficking either. We don't want families to lose their babies just because, there is a bit of temporary financial hardship. And having that discussion, I think, leads us to different options of solutions rather than the individual, because some are interested in finding their family and then we're actually building a relationship with them, and some are not. And I think both of these two or other options should really be for the individual to make that choice. But looking at what the society could do and perhaps should do or must do, the investigations are, I think, a very interesting new phase of adoption. So I'm happy to be part of that or be able to witness that. And that shows, sadly, again, just how similar this system has been across borders and across cultures.
I was struck last year in a conversation. It was about this time last year. Someone said to me, someone who, I won't say their profession because I have to live here, but their comment to me when they asked, well, what do you do? What's your research on? And I said, well, I write about, I guess, adoption and rights and so on. And they said to me, adoption? No one adopts anymore, surely. We were eating dinner, so it was okay. I was able to sort of, gather my head together. So sadly, she got the talk. I sort of gave she pressed the buttons and she got the talk. And I said, yeah, well, yes, they do. The issues of adoption, you can see them with surrogacy. You can see them with donor children. I said, adoptees are everywhere. I didn't add, you're not going to one. I didn't say that. That would have been unnecessary. I said, but, adoptees are everywhere. I says, and, we grow up and we get a bit grumpy. I said, but, I can assure you it's very much a timely, topical thing. And then we talked, I got her onto mother-baby homes and we spoke of, I think I ruined her dinner, in fairness, because you don't want, over your dessert, you don't want to hear about, the vengeful spirits and some of the things that I covered yesterday. But, she started, her fault, she started it. But I thought the comment stayed with, no one adopts anymore. I thought, there are, hello, I think we can be a bit invisible at times. It's not up there with the comment of, but aren't you grateful? Because if I get that once more, I may snap. Yes, I'm grateful, but,
It's a truism, isn't it, that wherever there's inequality in the world, people get adopted. That there's a relationship between adoption and inequality. Social, racial, the ways we could unpack that. That's one response. Another point to make in it, and it comes from conversation about the different kinds of adoptees that we are, and that we can be. I think that's a really important point to hold on to understand that the adoptee really doesn't exist. Adoptees in the plural is perhaps the route we need to go down. And I say that because on the one hand, I think this event has really underlined the variety and multiplicity of adoptee experience and adoptee positions, which are recognizable across nations and cultures, of course. Yeah. And I say that because I think one of the other things that has emerged at this event, and this is what I found, productively challenging, if I can put it that way, is the potential meta-narrative of the adoptee that perhaps sometimes kind of calcifies in certain positions or traditions or even disciplines. What do I mean here? I mean the assumption that the adoptee is by default a traumatized subject. Yeah. So I was fascinated to hear that, and colleagues must correct me if I'm wrong, that here in Northern Ireland, if you're an adoptee, you have a right to, as an adult, to free counselling. Yeah. Which got me thinking, okay, well, what's underwriting that? Is there, some kind of assumption that adoptees are de facto traumatized figures. And that, I would want to push back against a little bit. If I was to think about my own modest subjectivity in relation to these matters, I find it very difficult to frame my own adoptive history in terms of trauma. When we start talking about reunion and meeting those who were at the so-called origin, that's when it got a bit traumatic, but not the adopted subjectivity itself. So I just wonder sometimes if there's opportunities at events like this, for us all just to keep open that sense of variety we were thinking about a moment or two ago, not least because I think we've got to watch there are not, other cliches of adoptive subjectivity or adoptive relations that might, even in a very sympathetic way, overpower the specificity of those lives and those relations, which are not readily computable, perhaps, in even the most sympathetic available models.
Well, one of the things I think you're absolutely right, John. I think also, anybody in the so-called triad is pathologized in the literature on adoption, and whether it's psychology, psychiatry, the core, the law, just in popular culture. And I think that is one of the things that for me is often a point of interest, in that I like to flip things back and treat adoption as a critical lens for looking at the norms that have been set up about what a family is supposed to be, what a family subject is supposed to be, and how adoption and the ways in which people with adoptive relationships, in whatever corner of the triad they end up in, even as that's a dated phrase, offer us also a lens to challenge our ideas about what parents are, what siblings are, what families are. And it's interesting in terms of your point about trauma, in that, for instance, there's a great debate in the increasing debate in the context of feminism, where historically, as feminists started to push back on gender inequality, they might use the word victim, but trauma wasn't necessarily associated with it. The idea of having been victimized by patriarchy was actually a rallying cry for, reacting and activism and being quite active, not being debilitated and, a sniveling mess or something as a result of having been traumatized. There wasn't the pathology associated with it. And I think one of the things, as it relates to a lot of adoption rights questions, is we are in a time in history where many people, in order to access their rights, have to present themselves as somehow traumatized, and the right is restoring, their psyche. And while that can accomplish certain things in terms of fights for rights, it can also contribute to things that are undermining as well, because you're still conforming to a norm when you should just have the right and not have to demonstrate your pathology in order to get it. So, I think that's a very interesting point that you make. And I also recognize the strategy in terms of accessing rights, but I also think it comes at a cost. Also, too, because you lose people in a movement who don't identify in that way. It can divide people. And so that there has to be, as you wrote about and presented at the symposium, there has to be room for a plurality of experiences for the best outcomes in terms of fighting for things. So
that's so spot on. Yeah. If nothing else, we should memorize what Frances just said.
We have it recorded. I'm going to laminate it and put it up around the thing. But yeah.
But I think I want to comment is what you brought up multiplicity. And when we started one of these investigations and we asked adoptees, what have you experienced? What have you been exposed to? What have you survived? And that is so complicated to put down in one or two words. Instead, we actually ended up with, now I think we are at 58 categories of violations. And so I think maybe that's what we understand instinctively as adoptees, that adoptees is not a single thing, and when we talk about violations or human breaches of human rights, it's anything from my papers seem to not be correct, so I can't get access to them. Plus, I remember I was kidnapped. I remember I was in an institution where I was violated or abused. It's all of that. And so when we're met with these, to be honest, rather simple expectations, you're adopted. Did you find your mom and dad? It doesn't really click in any way at all. And so definitely, I think if we can accept that adoption is irrelevant and is a contemporary issue, hopefully people would, as a minority, not group us into one dimension, but understand that there are all of these different experiences. And if you want to communicate with us, then it might require a little bit of, preparation. And just respect from what we have experienced and the different histories that there are and have formed the time that we live in now. But definitely just saying you're adopted and then though, oh, well, probably your mother was poor or something like that. It's really extremely, oversimplifying to an extent where becomes a bit of an offense to assume that. So I think the reason why I appreciate so much what you've done with this seminar is to show all these different disciplines, these different worlds and different lenses that you can look at adoption at. So we don't end up oversimplifying it or, oversimplify it.
Yeah, we do tend to be. There are a few stereotypes of us out there, ranging from, the be afraid, be careful, be fearful, or the punchline. So many examples I could give, but I won't. But I could. So many examples of, popular culture and stuff where it's, well, I'll do Loki because he's my favorite. But, in the Avengers, don't mind my brother, he's adopted. And I think, really, I've come to the cinema to see a bit of Marvel, and there it is. So Emily and I were chatting before. We talked about Elf and Will Ferrell. So, you've got your adoption. I can sort of forgive him. Because it is,
it's fun.
Yeah. Him I can just about forgive because he's running around in the mustard tights. He's making himself colorful and funny. But there's so many others. You can be really enjoying a good book and in pops a throwaway comment, like, I'd put you into care if you weren't over 16. And I think, not funny. And so, and we talked rehoming yesterday, came up somehow through. The online participants were good, weren't they? We got some very good voices coming in, from the Zoom. And yeah, the rehoming thing popped up.
There was one moment yesterday which completely blew my mind. And it was, I think it was during the conversation between the justice, yeah? And a member, an online contributor who I think was, I forget their name, but was connected to the Scottish adult adoption movement, I think, SAAM, FEE, yeah.
Yes.
I think it was FEE, and please do correct me, if but my memory isn't that great, especially after the conference dinner last night, I have to say, and the joyful conviviality of that occasion, where I think there was, I think we were reminded that in the UK, when one was adopted, one's first or original birth certificate is cancelled, yeah, and it's replaced by another one which has the legal name on it. So it's not as if you had one birth certificate and then you had another. The first one is cancelled completely, so you start again with one. And I'm sure it was Fee who asked the member of the judiciary, why can't that first birth certificate be reanimated, recharged? Why can't I have access to that as my documentary evidence of my origin, which had never, ever occurred to me all these years of, being an adoptee and thinking about adoption. And it was that kind of questioning. It's that kind of attention to the shortcomings, perhaps, and the constraints of the law I found was absolutely, I'd never thought of it in that way or thought of documentation in that way in the British context. So I'm just reporting this. I just thought it was one of those kind of magnificent moments where actually coming together from a different range of positions is utterly educative.
Well, I also thought the comments related to documents in terms of restoring national origins with a passport or So if you're a transnational adoptee, and it strikes me that it's easier. I only know this because I have 2 friends in Canada whose grandfathers were Irish. And as a result of having an Irish grandparent, we're able to get an Irish passport. So if it's that easy being, 2 generations away to get a passport, why wouldn't there also be a way for an adoptee who's only 1 generation away from their, parent in the country from which they originated? Why wouldn't they be able to get their national identity or status, back in some easy fashion? I mean, just because it is so easy for these people, by virtue of this biological tie. So I found that contradiction in terms of who has what rights. When we were talking about that, very troubling. It seems that should be something that should be much easier if that is indeed what the person wants. Doesn't have to be this hard.
Korea has done a little bit in that direction, and so adoptees are actually eligible for Korean citizenship. Then the funny thing, which is obviously not funny, but we found out that a lot of the adoptees have been switched, so they've been sent in another person's identity, but the switched identity is then, the legal identity. So I had a friend who wanted to get back her Korean citizenship, but she would have to do that in the switched identity, in the identity that she at that point knew was not her, then switch to that, then get the Korean citizenship in a name that is not her, and then after that go through another process to then go back to what would be her original identity. And so I think what we see now, obviously because we get older and so we do, we're more visible in society, but these are really issues that come with being adopted. This is not unique. I mean, I think we all have examples that are equally really unthinkable from friends and from ourselves, maybe.
You remind me of a film. I'm a great admirer of a director called Diane Boucher Liam.
Yes,
I'm sure
yes.
you know it, In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee, I think it's called.
Yes.
And it deals with exactly that kind of process that she was, when she moved to the United States, she moved with an identity of another child that had been imposed upon her, I think, a few months before the plane took off, to the extent that a photograph was swapped in the documents. And you think, well, there's one example. To hear there are thousands is chilling.
That's the truth for now, at least, that we know.
Yeah. And yet there are those who would say, but it's not trafficking. What is it then? Please explain. Please tell us what it might be. I only had, I suppose, I had 2, but I'll park Nancy Verrier because it's just because interesting in the last couple of weeks, you're the second person I know looks as John starts to combust. But she's an adoptive mom. She wrote a very famous book called The Primal Wound that basically tells us we're all wounded and traumatized and broken and from birth because your mother's gone. And yes, I know you're not happy with it. I have many friends who aren't happy with that. They're saying it's quite insulting. I sort of think, I'm broken. Yeah, I can live with that. I'm glued back together. Sylvia Plath got glued back together, put me back together with twine and tapers. Or the beautiful pottery that has the gold inlay,
It's a bit convenient, isn't it? It's a bit, there's your meta-narrative.
If it gets me funding, if I get extra funding for being special, I'm very venal. So, whatever will, if it gets, if it stops me being discriminated against, I'm a cheap date. What can I say? I'm like, give me whatever, work. But I do take the point. I just thought it was interesting that within the space of 2 weeks, you were the second person to say, I hate that book. I don't like that notion.
It drives me crazy too.
And you,
I mean, it's not, I think it represents a very strong idea in our culture about what the biological bond, the biological tie is. For me, it's the natural, because of course there are mothers. I mean, it puts a lot of pressure on women as mothers. I mean, one need only think of all the women who suffer they're pathologized as suffering postpartum depression. It might just be, oh my God, I bought into this fairy tale of motherhood. And now that I'm here, I think, what have I done? And boy, am I ever depressed. about the life I have to live in order to, to realize this ideal of motherhood. So I think, again, there's not one size fits all for women either as mothers. And so this idea that every woman who has a baby is necessarily going to be attached to it and be a great parent is a lot of pressure on women as well. And I think that also speaks to the pathology of everybody in the triad, for instance, as it relates to mothers who might have relinquished, a child as opposed to surrendered a child. So because there are some women who make those choices, they may have some regrets, but under their circumstances or what have you, they have made a decision that they could live with that best suited them at the time, and they felt best suited the child at the time. So I think all of the stories are complicated. And even if a majority of women, there are a majority of women who surrendered as opposed to relinquished, it also means the women who did relinquish, if they did, are marginalized even within the broader group of people who still might want to have connections to their children that were adopted. Because if you confessed that you relinquished willingly for whatever reason, people might see you as a monster as well. So, and that's one of the things that mothers who have surrendered or relinquished face if and when at a later date or at any time they want to maintain their connections with their children. So, I think it's all of these things are complicated for a lot of reasons. So, anyway, just thought I'd throw that in there based on
my trembling. Absolutely. I would want to put against the primal wound position Emily Hitchin's paper that we listened to a day or so ago, where she invited us to think about adoptee difference, I think was her phrase, as not that different to other forms of difference, and to account for the specificities of adopted life in a more agile, dimensional, imaginative, and maybe more accurate way, more sensitive to the varieties of intersection that may well be empowering us and constraining us and producing us. And I think I would rather go down, and it comes back to things we were talking about 10 minutes or so ago, I would rather go down that path and try to think with that kind of opportunity than perhaps to park intellectually my car in one position. And this will sound more unkind than it's meant to be, but rather than be told by someone who's never met me who I am.
No, that's a fair comment.
Nobody likes to be told who they are. Even if they ask, who do you think you are?
Very true. And then my other sort of, maybe not final question, but coming near final, when we talked about tying in with nationality, citizenship, passports, being able to just have that link to the ancestry. My own axe to grind is because I was a Quebec adoptee, I lose out on the Newfoundland Indigenous heritage because I can't prove that link. Even though I'm in reunion, and even though the mothership has offered to go in and talk to whoever needs spoken to, we can't make that link. I can't get my, the tribal membership. Not that I'm not going to move over anytime soon, but it would be quite nice. So yeah, Canadian passport, I cannot get. I have a certificate of citizenship, but not a birth certificate. And I think, why is there so much, as a lawyer, why is there magic in the piece of paper? The piece of paper can open up everything. It can start your fairy tale. It can start your nightmare. It can block doors. It can be falsified. Redacted, falsified, lost in a fire, lost in a flood, these magical bits of paper. I just wondered what people thought about the magic of the piece of paper.
Well, put it this way. Well, two things to say, but very briefly. First of all, to take that phrase, the magic of the piece of paper. When I got all my documentation through, when I was searching for it and requested it, in the UK, I didn't get a series of magic documents that somehow, in which the spell that unraveled my personhood was waiting. I got documents that actually bore witness to the mendacity and the unprofessionalism of those who were involved in rearranging my kinship. That's the first thing. Second thing I'll say very, very briefly is I've never in my life, I made a decision I was not going to think of myself or position myself in terms of belonging through the biogenetic route. Okay. And my birth mother was from the west of Ireland. But I've always said, no, I'm not Irish. I was raised by Scottish parents in England. And that kind of exhausts where things are. And now we have Brexit. And as a British passport holder who no longer has rights of access to the EU in the ways that I used to, as I understand things, because I've got an Irish birth mother, I have a right to Irish citizenship. And for the first time in my life, that's attractive. And I'm seriously thinking, well, do I activate that right if it is empowering to me as a global citizen? Yeah. So, and I hate that, actually. I don't really want to do that because in a sense I would be claiming something that's legally recognizable, but for me as a subject is not legitimate for me. It's not how I would position myself in terms of kinship and belonging and cultural identity and those kinds of things. So I'm rather torn. So, and maybe the image of a torn document might be appropriate here.
Oh, I like that. I'm thinking airport queues. Trust me, as an Irish passport holder, it's quite gratifying, and obviously did not vote for Brexit. It's very gratifying when you walk past. I'm not a good person. I'm quite mean. But there's the quick lane for the EU people, and you've seen this. It's amazing to see.
I saw it on the way in.
Well, sorry, they were warned. They still voted to leave. But
lots of us didn't, I have to say as well.
I know. Yes, no, I know. Not looking in your direction, but keep me posted. I'd like to know if you go for your Irish passport. I think you should. You should. Why not? Just airport queues. There's your justification. Maybe.
Sometimes you just have to be practical.
Yes. That's what it is. Yeah. And then the very final one. We talked about terminology and the names of things, the representations of things. And I thought something we didn't maybe quite get on until quite late, sort of yesterday. I know birth mother, that was a term that was talked about in the Irish investigations, the UK one, and it was decided that mother is a better term. And some of the mothers who gave evidence said one of their concerns was they didn't want it to be portrayed that they voluntarily relinquished. They didn't want their child to be thinking, I didn't put up a fight. You see that sometimes in freeing order cases here. You'll get the odd statement from a mother saying, the reason why I'm not consenting, I don't want this child to look back someday and think that I didn't want to keep them. And it's just the power of words there. And some of the mothers said about being doubly stigmatized. It wasn't just you had a child out of wedlock, you then did the second cardinal sin of easily parting with them. Even though some of them, quite heartrending stories of just coming back and the child was gone. Or they would hide the magic of little objects. They would try and hide a letter, hide an object with them. And they would say, I hope the nuns or social workers don't take this away. We know that quite possibly they might have. Because, as you said, falsified names being changed. So I just thought I'd throw that happy thought out there.
So maybe not so much on the terminology, but what keeps happening in Korea right now is we see religious groups associated with the adoption industry have this term, no shame, no blame, no name, that they use for advocating for the baby box. And so the baby box is illegal, but they keep popping up and nothing is being done with that. And obviously it's much easier to remove a child that doesn't really exist in the system. You can just launder their identity and everybody gets a clean slate, can start all over. And then knowing that is happening now, I think it shows where, the foundation of adoption, where you do need to, you do need to shame a certain group of people to bring them into this position where they want to voluntarily, in quotes, to give up the child. But I heard that in Wales, that recently there've been an apology actually for just that, where they go back and say it is for shaming the mothers, that we want to set the record straight or do things right now. I could only wish that filtered over to Korea, so you don't bring people into this position where there really is very little choice.
And the inheritance of stigma. So it affects, it goes up, it goes down. You've got grandparents thinking, were we to blame? Were we complicit? You've got the children of adoptees saying, well, there's a broken link back up there, or that's something my mother didn't speak about. So you can pack quite a lot of generations into, one act.
I think with the nomenclature, we have to address people how they want to be addressed. That's the same in every context, So whether it's mother, birth mother, first mother, we need to listen and, be sensitive to those self-articulations. I think in my own thinking and in my own writing, I tend to default towards birth mother because I'd like to remind, especially the non-adopted, that these women were not permitted to mother. Yeah. And if mothering might be thought of at one level as a continual process of the delivery of care, yeah, that was not that right was not granted to them. Yeah, post contract. So I think the suffix does important historical work, and I've always myself, and I might be wrong about this, I suspect I am, blanched a little bit about first mother, second mother. Because I don't like the kind of ordinal system that seems to translate into primary, secondary. That I don't really want my birth mother or my mum kind of positioned a bit like a league table, in sport, where there's one and then there's two. I'd like to think of them more as in other ways. So I just worry a little bit about counting. I'd like to count them or account for them differently than a strictly numerical kind of model. So those from one adoptee position. Those are my kinds of kind of quibbles. And then as an aside, you're talking there about the tokens that are sometimes left with unfamilied children. If you ever go to the Foundling Museum in London, yeah, they have a collection of tokens that they have on display of little coins or messages or stamped bits of metal that were left with children in previous centuries. It's quite something. They're tiny. It's quite something to witness. And my colleague at the University of Leeds, Professor John McLeod, who's also a poet, has written a fantastic poem called Token, where he reflects upon these items. As he writes, I think at one point, scarred with kisses, which I think is a remarkable way of imagining the tokens. So it's a plug for London's Foundling Museum next time you're over.
I shall do that. Yes.
Yeah, the idea of having an object that was held in the hand by, your mother or your father or what have you. I mean, I think that speaks to many, many people for many different reasons. Even if you're not an adoptee, if you have a parent who's passed, those objects, I mean, people can identify with your experience as an adoptee, just with that, how profound that is as well. Having that object that would have been held in the hand and given, and here it is, something tangible, something material. Yeah. I mean, that's a very powerful thing. Even more so maybe than the piece of paper.
Well, I was just going to add to that's why I think we can get a bit obsessed with our documents and talk about original documents, and we want, the front page and the back page and the potential, stickers or pictures or images, anything that came with that. We want all of that, not necessarily to find family, but because that's part of a history. So it's part of me. It's part of what happened to me in those first days, months, or years. Everything is valuable. And so I think we can get stuck. A bit with the law when they say, you have the right to certain documents. In Korea, we have the right to 51 pieces of information. So it's all rewritten and comes out on, in a new word form. But it was obviously not computerized when we were adopted. And I think it's just that sense. It's a lot with the feelings. It's that sense. And also with belonging. This is mine. I have that. If I want, then I can make it public. but why on earth do these public officials have access to my documents and the social workers when it's a piece of my personal history? I think that can be frustrating.
Well, it's a rights violation. Give me my stuff.
Yes.
Give me I want to know my birth name, and I want to know, where my eyes came from.
So I want to throw that out there because I'm sure there will be a lot of qualified legal experts listening. That how is it possible that a private company can hold personal information?
Because we're dehumanized. We don't have human rights. They've dehumanized us. They've orphanized us. I could go on. But, that's how they do it. It's discrimination, and they justify it by saying, well, there's other privacy rights over here. We made these promises, and hence you can't have them. I mean, I'm paraphrasing what a lot of the international and domestic law would say. It's just my take on it. I could be wrong.
But even in the EU with the GDPR, I mean, I have the right to go and have all information about me deleted if I want, from buying shoes or being a member anywhere. But somehow I don't have the right to know what happened to me the first couple of months of my life. That's a problem.
Yeah, we're not to be trusted. They fear us, which is a pity. We get there. We'll gradually go out and overturn some cars now. We'll start our protest. Unless anyone has maybe a final reflection or a quick vent, are we done? I can sense tray bakes have arrived. Maybe sandwiches, I don't know. You coming up for coffee? Get a wee. You've got other stuff.
I would just like to thank you, Alice Diver, for having organized this and brought all of us together, and your outstanding work in organizing the speakers, the program, the great care you took of all of us in terms of making sure we were safely ensconced in lovely hotels. And I would also like to thank Susan Burton for everything she did.
We will pass that on.
To bring us all here as well. And all the people that have worked to make this just an outstanding symposium. I really have enjoyed this week.
You're very welcome. And thank you all for traveling over. Thank you so much. I'm here all week. But thank you guys as well for coming over and for talking so frankly and just giving me indulging me and giving me your time, putting up with me.